Welcome to this guest lecture on neuroaffirmative social work with autistic people. Today's esteemed guest is sociologist Hanna Bertilsdotter Rosqvist, who is both a professor in social work at Södertörn University and a senior lecturer in social work at Karlstad University. Bertilsdotter Rosqvist has long developed theories and methods within the field of neurodiversity studies, and in today's lecture she will introduce what she calls a neuroaffirmative approach to social work, which she will argue is crucial for providing better services to autistic people. Her lecture will last for about 45 minutes before Associate Professor Wenche Bekken from the Department of Social Work here at OsloMet will provide a comment. And before I give the word to Bertilsdotter Rosqvist, I'll just add that the lecture itself will be streamed and recorded, and that it's organized by the Center for the Study of Professions. So with that out of the way, I suggest we give a warm round of applause for Hanna.
Okay, many thanks. It's very exciting to be here. I've been in Oslo, of course, but I haven't been in the kind of academic community, perhaps also interested in university. It's kind of new for me. So I feel like I've been in Sweden for a long time, but I've mostly been working with people in UK. So sometimes I hope, or I would love to, have more collaboration in the Nordic countries, because we do have a special kind of context. And sometimes it's really about translating between different kinds of contexts. So I'm currently working on a edited book, which is mainly together with British people, because it's keep on being there that things is happening, but it's really complicated sometimes just to kind of reuse those concepts in another context. So basically, quickly, I won't go much into details, but this is my special interest. So I've been working with this for a long time. And I got into autism studies from queer studies. So my kind of background is gender studies and queer studies and sociology. And then I got into social work. So I think I'm kind of interdisciplinary person. And I'm kind of using tools from different ways, which is good. But it's not only about coming from different ways. It's also about trying to bridge between different professions. So as I'm coming from kind of sociology and more theoretical sciences and got into social work, trying to understand social work, I also realized that in order to do some neuroaffirmative work, social workers need to do a lot of bridging, not only between different professions, but also between communities. There's like the professional community here, and then it's the parents, and then it's the organizations, and then it's neurodivergent people, the communities. And I think sometimes social work is really good at that. Also, we do have the tools for bridging between communities to speak with different kinds of groups of people in order to do the work, the pragmatic approach, that there are work to be done. And in order to do that work, we need to collaborate. We can't just stand in our own kind of little piece of place here. We have to do some bridging and collaborate and communicate between different kinds of knowledges or communities. So there are things who's been kind of out now since a month. So Paragraph Handbook of Research Methods and Ethics and Neurodiversity Studies. This is Exploring Autistic Sexualities, Relationality and Genders. And my kind of old book now, Neurodiversity Studies, A New Critical Paradigm. So all those things are community work. So I've been collaborating with different kinds of academic people, of course, but there's a lot of piece of being in a community. So there are Facebook groups for autistic academics who are kind of meeting up in the World Wide Web, and we get together and try to do things together. So all the books are kind of a production of course, academic work and academics in academia, but it's also about being us as neurodivergent scholars, trying to develop neurodiversity from within. Så my upcoming book is Neuroaffirmativa perspektiv på autism och ADHD i skola, vård och socialt stöd. It's my first Swedish publication. So I've been working for a long time outside of Sweden, but I'm trying to get into Sweden. What does it mean to work in a Swedish context, but also try to make these things which are happening outside of Sweden, in London or England or USA, to be happening in Sweden as well. And I think that is why it would be nice and interesting to make the bridges within the Nordic countries as well. What does it mean to work neuroaffirmative in different kinds of Nordic contexts? But as Swedish context is as it is, sometimes, as I said in the beginning, I need to work outside of Sweden. And currently my main focus right now is to develop social work in a neuro-inclusive or neuroaffirmative way. And then I have to go to people in Britain because that's where I can find people to work with. But I hope there will be more people in the future who I can work with. So this is hopefully going to be published in 2026. So we have the contract, and I think the book will be called The Palgrave Handbook of Neuro-Inclusive Social Work, because when we kind of encountered Palgrave with this idea, they looked around and saw, oh no, there's nothing. That's really interesting. Why? We have a lot of books on neurodiversity. We have a lot of books on different ways to approach neurodivergent people. But what about social work? What are we? Where are we? What are we doing? So hopefully this will kind of support a paradigm shift within social work. So what I'm talking now is like, I don't know really now. This is a beginning on how to work more neuro-inclusive in social work. So my main points, or what I'm going to say, is mainly based on this Swedish book, Neuroaffirmative Perspektiv, which is a kind of collaboration, a collection of different kinds of people from different kinds of spheres, not just social workers, but different kinds of researchers and practitioners. And this is how this looks like in the proof process. So it's going to get out on studentlitteratur in late January or early February. And it's a combination, because we are very often combinations. So it's a really problem here that we have different traditions. We have the autism research field, and we have the diagnosis focused on autism. And people may think, oh, you have autism. But I'm not sure, because you don't really look like an autistic person. Because maybe you also have ADHD, and those can mask the different kinds of experiences. You can have autism, and you can be an ADHD, and when you come to the clinician and they try to look at you, you don't behave as an autistic person or an ADHD person because you're in the kind of combination. And I think it's about 50 or 80% of the neurodivergent population, which are both. And it wasn't just with the DSM-5 coming in 2013, where there was kind of recognized that you could have both diagnoses. So all people who are a bit older couldn't have a combination. So for us, when we were doing this book, it was important that there was about both. And I'm an autistic person, and Lil is an ADHD, and we also recognized our other. So I recognize my ADHD parts, and she recognized her autistic parts. It's not really kind of clear cuts. It's a little bit of a mixture. And both or us and the people who's contributing to the book is kind of mixture as well. Not really kind of perhaps identified, but kind of recognizing that it's not just clear cuts between autism and ADHD. So the lecture now is kind of going to do some kind of distinctions, but you have to have in mind that sometimes it's a matter of you want to kind of make something more clear to make it understandable, but still it's just ideas. It's kind of constructions in that way. But the background is a traditional, I think, sociological background. It's challenges of epistemic violence and injustice. Foremost, this kind of important and interesting concepts of testimonial injustice and hermeneutic injustice. When you're coming out as an autistic person, and you're perhaps saying to a person close to you that I'm autistic, and that person saying, no, you can't. You can't be autistic. Because you don't look autistic. That's a problem. And when I was coming out as a bisexual person in the late 1990s in Sweden, it was a similar problem. It was like, oh, you're bisexual, are you sure? Well, it's my body. I know what I feel. Are you really sure? Because you may not really be sure because, you know, bisexual doesn't know really what they are. So it's a kind of similar difficulties with injustice, epistemic injustice, which has been normalized. So when you're coming into the research field, and for a long time it was normalized that you didn't spoke directly to autistic people, but you spoke to their parents, their carers, the professionals around them. And you didn't think it was strange. It was just normal. Because why should you ask autistic people directly? Because they can't speak. Or if they speak, it's incomprehensible. There's really grave epistemic injustice here. This is an example from a friend of mine, autism research friend, and she said, as an example of this, "You don't learn anything," I said. "That's why it's boring." The neurotypicals in our surroundings laughed loudly and said something like, "Do you think a party is some fucking school or what?" At that moment, I felt I lacked the language to express myself in a way that didn't sound ridiculous or comical. As when I say something, I don't find parties interesting. They say, "Why? You shouldn't. Parties not interesting. It's fun." But I don't find it fun. It's really kind of basic here. We do have difficulties to understand that if I say something, you just have to listen. You don't have to evaluate. I just say that I don't find it fun because it's not interesting. So testimonial injustice is injustice related to someone not being trusted or believed in what they say. Or hermeneutical injustice, when an individual or group is unable to articulate their experiences due to a lack of shared language. Because if you come into the DSM-5, it's a lot of language, it's a lot about words, about autism or ADHD. But it's not my language. They're not kind of expressing my experiences. They are expressing an outsider perspective, who are looking at me and trying to evaluate my behaviors, my expressive behaviors, from a neurotypical point of perspective. So it's back to the queer studies. It's like in the beginning of the 20th century or late 19th century, heterosexual male sexologists was starting to build a foundational work or knowledge about the gays and the trans people. And they were looking from their medical perspective on those people who was kind of not conforming to gender or sexuality standards of that time, the bourgeoisie, the heterosexual family kind of sexuality and gender expressions. It's a really kind of very strange way of looking at something. It's from this kind of background that you're a bourgeoisie, white male, heterosexual person looking at something which you don't understand and try to define it. And it's similar to in DSM-5. It's like people from the outside who's looking at something they don't understand and trying to define it. They don't ask how it feels or how it is to be a certain kind of being or body who is in this society. So this is a kind of basic. We have a problem of epistemic violence. We have a problem of normalization of outsider perspectives who are othering certain experiences because they don't understand them, because they can't identify with them, because they kind of can't be like this. You can't behave like that. It can't. Yep, but I don't know what we are going to say now, because it's like if you just focus on what I can't do, because you don't do that or you can't or blah blah. It's like it's not a very constructive dialogue. So the neurodiversity approach is, for one thing, is like we have to go with the insider perspective because it's going to make something happening. We have to look for the insider perspective because it's do something what we think about autism and ADHD when we don't look at it from the outsider perspective. So when I hear sometimes people are a bit challenged or worried about the neurodiversity approach, for me it's like, oh, it's not really that big. It's just a kind of idea of that brains are different. So in this situation, in this space, both on Zoom and in this physical space, there are different kinds of brains. That's basic. That's nothing more. It's just we're different. And it's like, it's a human variation thing. It's not really something it just is. We doesn't have to value it in some way. It's just a way to be, a fundamental cognitive functioning styles that influence everything about the person and the way of being in the world. So it's just, it just is. And then the neurodiversity approach from that kind of basic sentence is that it's just a matter of human variation. They're just different. We are thinking about power issues, and then we come to the kind of distinctions between the more dominating forms of cognitive functioning styles, which is neurotypicality, similar to queer studies, heterosexuality. It's not like a distinct category here. We don't think about heterosexuals as an entity who's just all heterosexuals are the same. We don't think neurotypicals are all the same. It's like more like a way of thinking about the dominating cognitive functioning style, which most often is taken for granted, and which is kind of adapted to, and which all the kind of spaces are adapted to. And the other one, in this case, is the neurodivergent. It's like, it's not really kind of clear cut between. It's more like we have the cognitive dominating way of being neurotypical, and the ones who's kind of outside of that dominating cognitive functioning style. So neuroaffirmative approach is based on this neurodiversity ideas, that it's elementary to recognize and affirm neurological difference. It's like we don't have to work against it, we just have to work with it. So here we have now a first problem, because a lot of the debates around autism and ADHD is focusing on diagnosis. And diagnosis is an elementary, it's a outsider perspective. So again, we have to have this in mind, that diagnosis is a categorizing, a way of thinking, a way of looking at certain ways of cognitive functioning styles. So the diagnose is a kind of quite limited way of looking, and it's quite kind of making the boundaries quite harsh. So I think when it comes to neuroaffirmative approach, it's really not really about diagnosis. It's about function, that my brain function in a certain way, which sometimes makes it difficult for me to exist in this world, as it's kind of dominated by neurotypicals and designed for neurotypicals and designed for the needs of neurotypicals. So when you think about my support needs, it's always in a world which are kind of designed to meet the needs of neurotypicals. That's the kind of difference between special needs and needs. Some needs are normalized, they're just part of the surroundings, and some are special, and they're kind of produced as something extraordinary. So I prefer actually to work more with function or functionality, or Swedish funktionssätt, than diagnosis, because I think diagnosis is just a little bit of the story. Where the problems is not whether we are different, because we are. The problems is that most often neurodiversity, the differences of human brains, are kind of being talked about from a pathology perspective, that there are better or worse or good or blah blah different kinds of brains. It's more like, can we just leave that kind of defining in terms of that is, this is good, this is neurotypicality, and this is bad, this is neurodivergence. So I think neurodiversity approach, in basic, it's aligned well with both social and relational models of disability, focusing on stigma, discrimination, barriers, including the stress of being a neurominority. So if I'm coming out as an autistic person, and I'm doing my traditional lecturing in my social work department, or I do things, of course I'm going to be a bit stressed. Of course it's a bit uncomfortable so to be a neurominority and come out as an autistic person, because I'm kind of aware that there are a lot of ideas about what it means to be an autistic person, especially an autism researcher or an autistic professor or whatever. It's kind of, you have to meet up all those ideas. So of course it's a stress of being a neurominority in a neuromajority world. But it's also about changing the ways of how to support, also how can we support people? So it's critical towards the traditional medical models as deficits or pathology approaches to neurodivergence, focusing on our deficits as our challenges, focusing on individual targeted intervention. Like when you look upon the diagnosis again, it's like focusing on my communication and sociality challenges, my stimming, my problematic behaviors, my special interests. There's a lot of focus on what neurotypicals finds problematic in my behaviors and trying to change them, trying to stop me when I'm going too deep into my special interests. I'm very happy that they didn't stop me, because otherwise I wouldn't be doing my research, because research is my special interest. So there's a lot of kind of not focus on what this kind of diagnose manual thinks are the problems, and try to make neurodivergent people conform more to ways of, as a neurotypical ways of functioning. It's also about seeing or visualizing or making neuronormativity visible. Like in the queer studies, it was a lot about or is still a lot about how to see heteronormativity, how to queer sexual and gender conformativity. And similarly here is like how to see neuronormativity, because it's so taken for granted. It's like the normal thing to do. So it's really you have to work hard to see neurotypicality or neuronormativity. And then back to a celotogenic approach, which I think is basic also when it comes to social work. We try to work with what works rather than work with what not works. So try to find how can we support people's ways of functioning. And it can be said to be kind of strengths promoting way, but I think it's more about promoting or supporting the function. Also, if you have a person, I have a client here who have a certain way of functioning, I have to support that functioning. That is the kind of basic, I think, in neuroaffirmative approach. Not to evaluate, just to support its way of functioning. And here are some theories. And this is not my theories. It's like I have done some mapping. I've kind of constructed a kind of map with different kinds of theories currently on the go or emerging or in neurodiversity studies or neurodiversity approaches in autism studies mainly, but also in ADHD studies. So some of them have a long history, and some of them is more new things. And here I come to a bit of a categorizing, and I have been kind of people have been asking me, why do I do these challenges? Not challenges, but these categorizes. Isn't it bad to do a lot of categorizing? But I think this is just a matter of making it a bit more illustrative, to think a little bit outside of the traditional way of thinking about autism and ADHD. So for me, it has been very kind of useful to rethink attention. As when I came some years ago, not that long ago, I came into ADHD studies. I had to rethink attention, because when I think about attention, it's laden or loaded with different kinds of ideas. So I had to rethink attention in order to rethink ADHD. And in the autism studies field, this has been going on for a long time. As people have been exploring autistic attention since 2005 at least, with the idea of monotropism. So when it comes to autism, we have a kind of quite strong foundation to rethink autistic attention. We talk about monotropic attention or getting into the flow states. But when it comes to ADHD, it's quite a more new thing to rethink attention in ADHD. So this is something coming from the ADHD community, where they're talking about variable attention. As when you're kind of switching between hyperfocus or hypofocus. It's not like I don't have, or I'm a kind of deficit attention. I just have a different way of focus. And sometimes it's really, really focused, and sometimes it's not. And the common thing here, the overlaps, is that both the autistic and ADHD attention is interest-based. So we have to understand that. We can't just focus. We have to focus on what is really interesting. And that is really interesting. That's not, it makes a bit more sense when you think about, it's not just to say, oh, you can't. Where how is your attention how is it working? So, and this also had to be understood in relationship to ideas of, we don't say neurotypical attention, but that is what this is. It's neurotypical attention, which is polytropic, also connected to the autism theory of monotropic attention. The other kind of attention here is polytropic attention. So in relationship to monotropic attention, which is kind of focusing deep, 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 and when it's hard, it's cognitive costly to change focus when you're deep, deep, deep in the rabbit hole. In contrast to the monotropic attention, polytropic attention is mingle. I don't know if it's a good one in English, but mingla. You are kind of in the big conference space, and you speak a lot of different kinds of people, and you're supposed to be networking, and you're supposed to be marketing yourself in a very, very brief time of your life. And neurotypical people are extremely good at that. So it's really easy for them to jump between different subjects and different focuses because they are not that deep in the rabbit hole as an autistic person. So it doesn't cost that much. But it's also selective and social. So not interest-based, not focusing on what I really, really feel and think is interesting, but more social and selective, which means I focus on what the person here is on the hierarchy stage. Is that person a professor? I'm really going to listen to that person. If it's not, I'm not sure if I'm going to focus on that person, perhaps another day. So it's a kind of socially engineered focusing. As your attention is focused on what is suitable for you right now in this kind of hierarchy. How are you going to approach different kinds of people depending on their social statuses or your own? And then we have the intensity and energy. As sometimes when you look at the DSM-5, intensity or energy is described as, forgot about that, but it just dropped my mind. But I think about it as a kind of how you spend energy. Sometimes people say, I'm too intense. And I say, I can't do anything about it because it's part of my cognitive makeup. So when the thing is about intensity, sometimes it's a matter of you're assuming a person to be quite even, or jämn in svenska. That you're supposed to be coming to your job and work from 8 to 5 in a kind of smooth way. You shouldn't have this kind of intensity energy. You can't kind of spend all your energy in the first 2 hours in the day and then be spent. It's not good. So it's much about how much energy are you spending during a whole day, which means you may be very intense or you may be more kind of jämn. And then it's about the cognitive process, which is more of a traditional idea about autism, that we are detail-oriented or bottom-up. And in relationship to that, I think ADHD is about variable, to be both sometimes detail-oriented and sometimes top-down, while neurotypical people is more generally top-down or reusing different categories. Like I'm coming into a room, I do it for the first time in my life, even if I'm doing it for several days a week, I keep on doing it for the first time because I keep doing it from the bottom up. I keep on doing it from the small details up to the big picture. But a neurotypical researcher or presenter might find herself in an audience and keep doing what she usually do because here she's reusing a lot of things, which makes it less costly to do it. And then we have the social interaction. I don't have a better word for it, but you can talk about sociability or sociality. And as this lecture is not that long, I can continue to talk about this for ages. It will be very, very brief. So now I kind of do some distinctions between manifest communication or interaction. So when you get again back to DSM-5, they talk about me or my way of being as a social deficit. I think more about this as a different way of communicating, a different way of being social. I'm interest-based in my social interaction. I do manifest communication. And in comparison, people who are neurotypical are more into latent communication. So if you do understand that, I think it's easy to communicate. If you understand that we are sometimes talking in parallel, it's almost like when I meet up a neurotypical person and the person is saying, how are you? And for me, from my manifest communication style, I think, how am I? How do I feel right now? I feel a bit stressed, I'm a little bit tired, and I start to communicate that to the person who get a bit, oh no, I don't want to hear everything about you. Not now. We just had 2 minutes perhaps. And I felt like, oh, sorry, I thought you meant that. And she or she said, oh no, didn't understand that I didn't meant that. I was saying something else. And I was like, how could I understand that? Oh yeah, of course, you are speaking latent. I'm speaking manifest. And these are different communication styles. There's kind of different kind of languages. It's like Norwegian and Swedish. I kind of understand it, but I don't. I try to understand, but it doesn't work. So I speak English instead. Sorry. So I think it's good to have that idea that we have Norwegian and we have Swedish here, and it's really kind of hard sometimes to understand. And if I do understand that, it's not a problem. I speak English instead. So the last thing here, motivation learning, which I think is important when you want to do some social interventions or treatments, you have to think about motivation and learning. How do people learn? How can you motivate people to do something? And then back again, I am interest-based. My social interaction and motivation for learning is interest-based. I have to be kind of seduced. My brain has to be seduced, because otherwise I won't be able to function. Because I kind of think about other things, or I can't get into that focus mode, and I really have to get into the focus mode in order to learn. So it was really, really easy for me to do research, because I'm really interested in that. But some things, it's just not, I can't learn it, because it's not interesting enough. And my motivation for it's kind of not that big. And I think that's the same thing when you're a kid in school, or you're a depressed person and meeting a social worker. And the kind of social workers say, you have to change this because it doesn't work for you. And you kind of know it, but it's really boring. And then you have to think, how can I motivate the person from the idea that the person is interest-based in the motivation? I can't say to the person, you have to stop drinking. Because it's like, yeah, why not? You can't. Yeah, but I don't kind of thrive. I don't get motivated because you, as an authority, saying to me that I'm supposed to be changing, because it won't work. So back again, this kind of selective social attention and interaction, which is kind of natural for neurotypicals, it doesn't work. It has to be more, I'm motivated because it feels right for me. It's kind of playing with my brain. I don't know how much time I... Oh, good. Maybe I won't be able to do every slides, I think, but cognitive challenges, because there are, of course, challenges. Sometimes people ask me, do you have a disability? Or do you think autism is a disability, or ADHD is a disability? And I don't know. Sometimes it's definitely, sometimes it's not. And I think among the challenges, which is good for social workers and every professional working with autistic or ADHD people, is to be aware that this cognitive functioning do have their problems. Sometimes it's really easy to get an overload. So if you are in a socially or sensory exhausting environment, like in a cafe or a restaurant, I turn easily overloaded. I kind of, my brain stops. It's not really, it stops functioning. It's getting slower and slower and slower. And if I kind of aware of this, that this is a really exhausting situation for me, my brain doesn't get the time is needed to process everything. So it's getting just more and more and more. I can't process it. And then I'm going to get meltdown. And as I'm a grown-up woman now, and I kind of know how I function, I don't easily get into the meltdown situation in public, because I kind of know there are signs. I have a clear idea of what my overload signs are. And if I think about the social worker again, meeting up a client who's newly diagnosed, or newly kind of into thinking about her or himself as autistic or ADHD, maybe they don't know that. Maybe they don't have the idea of their overloads. They just get into different situations, which are meltdowns or shutdowns. And then it's good to kind of think about, what is your role now as a support person? perhaps support the client to understand their function. Not to say that you need to train on your attention or your social ability, but to think about how does your body work? What is the first signs of your overloads? Because we don't want to get into meltdowns or shutdowns. That's a really bad thing. You get exhausted, and sometimes it's shameful to get a panic attack in public. And now I just have to say it's different. A meltdown and panic attack is not the same, but they can look similar, which sometimes means that you don't understand it's a meltdown. You think it's a panic attack. And another thing is also getting stuck as you're really tired. It's again about cognitive. Your brain has got too much on its plates and doesn't really have the time to process. Then maybe you get stuck. And as an autistic person, and this is coming from the community, we talk about inertia. You're suddenly sitting, you're seeing yourself sitting on a sofa and you can't get out of it. You don't really want to be in sofa, but it's so heavy. The body is just so tired and you can't really think about how to get out of the sofa. And the ADHD type, I think, is the loop. So that you're kind of feeling, you get stuck in a certain idea and you get more and more agitated and then you get really, really angry until you explode. And the similar things here is not the expressions are different, but I think it's the same kind of foundation. It's that you're really, really tired and you're getting stuck. And then we have the big, big spooky thing, the monster in the space. It's burnout. And it's so common among autistic and ADHD people. So it's like common. It's like everybody almost get it. And that is a big tragedy. And that is why I kind of sometimes feel a bit angry. It's like a lot of kind of people or professionals are putting a lot of thoughts in different kinds of social interventions or interactions, or also training people to become more neurotypical looking also, or just trying to support. And they are forgetting about the burnout. They are just seeing a person who doesn't really function and don't think about burnout. Perhaps they think about it as a person who is not going to school or who's have a long sickness leave or whatever, but they don't think about, oh, here we have a very particular kind of burnout. It's not just a general kind of burnout, that's a neurotypical kind of burnout, which is supposed to be rehabilitated in a certain way. But we have another kind of burnout. We have the autistic or the ADHD burnout. It's not really a fun thing to think about. And this is, I'm not going to look at or talk about, but I'm just going to give some descriptions of this autistic and ADHD burnout, to just think about that sometimes when people get diagnosed in the adult year, or perhaps when they're younger, perhaps it's not just that they have ADHD or autism. Perhaps it's because they have an autistic burnout or an ADHD burnout. Because in those stages, everything is working much, much worse. So autistic burnout is defined by Rainmaker in 2020, it's not that long ago. A state that arises from chronic life stress and situations where personal and others' expectations of an autistic individual's abilities do not align with their actual functioning capacity. Autistic burnout is a pervasive and long-lasting exhaustion that results in functional loss and decreased tolerance to sensory input. So everything which you kind of sometimes think about as autism, maybe it's mostly about autistic burnout. And then we have the ADHD kind, which is similar. It's like the same kind of roots here. It's just a matter of looking more like an ADHD person. Also, sometimes things which is working when you're not in a burnout, it really doesn't work when you're in a burnout. So the ADHD version, and this is coming from the internet, so I haven't found it really yet in the research papers, but I hope it will come. It's a state of physical, mental, and emotional exhausting caused by prolonged stress. It manifests as overwhelming fatigue, reduced productivity, and feelings of hopelessness or despair. The ADHD-related difficulties are exacerbated, making it even harder to initiate or complete tasks, maintain focus and attention, and regulate emotions, meaning you get a really kind of emotional person who's really kind of not really maintaining or regulating the emotions. So everything which you kind of sometimes think about as ADHD, maybe it's just ADHD burnout. So I think the main point here is how to support people to live with, not against, their neurodivergence. So a lot of things I think is now the common treatments or interventions is actually self-disturbing, as not supporting this autistic and or ADHD functioning. And sometimes I think there is a lot of, you don't know really about masking, that a lot of autistic people or ADHD people actually are masking because in different ways they don't feel like they can be seen as neurodivergent. And then it's about, sometimes you need to mask because it's too dangerous otherwise, but sometimes you need a supporting environment which are supporting you to unmask. And sometimes you need to stim, and to be aware of that it's fine to stim, because stimming is also part of your cognitive makeup, that you need this to support your cognitive functioning. Maybe I should stop here. I don't know how much I can see. So as a bit of a wrap up. So I think for neurodivergent people, it's about self-research. We need to self-research in order to become happy or more looking for what feels good, actually. And in the Swedish book, we talk a lot about how to do this. I won't go into much more details. And to give neuroaffirmative support is to be an ally, to be an interpreter, to support different kinds of perhaps engaged people to communicate together and provide support in self-discovery. Because again, a person is coming to a client who is perhaps newly diagnosed, and that person needs support to self-discover. So I'm really fine with the kind of early intervention, early detection thing in a kind of another way. If you rethink early detection and early intervention, and more think about we need to kind of, people need to understand that they have a certain way of functioning. And then they have to have perhaps people around them who can support them in their self-development and self-exploration in their brains, to be friend with your brain, not to say that, oh, you have a pathological brain, you shouldn't work, you shouldn't be like that. No, you have another brain, it doesn't work as a majority brain, and you have to support that brain, because it's not really easy sometimes to be in a neuro minority situation. That means that when we are designing support, and of course also support measures, we have to kind of do it together with the neurodivergent people, of course. So we kind of know what needs to be done, so we don't focus on things which not needs to be done. And we have to also define what we do, what we are supposed to measure and how to measure it. As what constitutes a good outcome, as it's based on person needs. As you can't define an outcome based on my ideas of what is a good outcome. So for example, sometimes I'm kind of thinking about, I meet a client and think about what could be a good outcome. How are we going to kind of measure our support interventions? And for that person, maybe a good outcome is to having a reduced frequency of meltdowns or shutdowns. Maybe that. And I have to work with that, because it's not nice to have meltdown in public space. It gets really exhausting and a bit shameful. So I think it's important to kind of rethink what is good outcome and how to measure that and work with that people or the groups, the community. And then to be aware of that this is still an environment which are not neuroaffirmative. We are still living in a kind of disabling environment. So we have to kind of, similar to people with, so it's not white, we have to live with that. I'm giving support to a person who's living as a neuro minority in a neuro majority world. That's it. Thank you. Det är nu jag ska sitta med här. And I'm going to run around because I have to. I can't just sit. It's going to be terrible. Yeah. Huh?
Okay. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. It's both interesting and thought-provoking, I think. And what I will do now, is it working? Battery.
No.
Okay. Sånn?
Ja.
Nå da. Nå hører dere. Okay, so what I will do is that I will give some reflections on your, of course, your lecture here, but I also read some of your work, and it's really interesting. I really think you should read it, because that's how I reflect, and so my reflection is also out of what I've read. So again, I think it's really interesting. And I think that this knowledge, and after that I will ask you some questions, and maybe that you can elaborate on, or maybe we can discuss or have a dialogue about. So I think that this knowledge is most needed. So thank you for your work. Neurodivergency, or being competent on how to understand neurodivergency and also understand what neuroaffirmativity is about, is pressing on. Not only in school, but also in the child welfare services, because an upcoming book is about social work in school. And seen in light of social work, however, also generally, but since we are contextualizing your work to social work today, I like how you navigate between specific or individual, the specific and the individual, and the structural at the same time. You're not making the divide, and that's more visible in your work that you write on your colleagues. It's quite because you use the critical perspective. You provide insights about a group of people or neurodivergency from a critical perspective, and thereby helps the reader to see the importance of seeing the specific, but also the construction of diagnosis in the neurodivergent perspective. The critical perspective reveals power structures as the impact of language, who owns the language, knowledge and privileges. The critical perspective also raises central questions about how socio-economic conditions, gender, ethnicity, etc., impacts on being neurodivergent. And as working myself within disability, we also know that being disabled increases the risk of poverty. As I said, you give knowledge about the specific and general related to neurodivergency. Specific, as an example, mental health issues as autistic, burnout or meltdown, as you just spoke about, and strategies for coping, and knowledge leaving us with, and also knowledge with seeing the normality. And this is interesting and really interesting and good about your work in special people's lives, embracing diversity, or thereby embracing diversity. So, from your perspective, you bring us right into a central debate in social work, which is also about the insider and outsider perspective. But it's in social work, it's about finding the balance between working from finding the balance between working from an individualistic perspective and a social perspective, which in practice often ends up in only seeing the individual or the problem or the atypical. And this, and thereby leaving the critical understanding of the diagnosis or the disabilities or divergency that is left out, or you are leaving this perspective because you are in some way stuck in what is the problem and what is the atypical. And of course, this is not just about the social worker, but also about the institutions where you work at, other professional group, etc. However, In many cases, this can only uphold oppressing norms or stereotypical understanding of people with disability of neurodivergency. So in the critical perspective and an affirmative understanding, it helps us to see normality by working with the person's life world, and at the same time work with the initiatives that are supporting the individual. And here I see the social work. So what I would like you to elaborate on or to discuss with me is what is your experience or opinion on how this balance between the individual or not seeing only the idea about the special cognitive person and the social in different social work practices or situation? Is it room for working relational or with peers, for example, in school, to work with peers in the schoolyard, for example? Or put another way, how much room is there for working with different strategies that will enable the person socially in different social work settings?
Oh, that was big. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to answer, but I think a lot can be done to rethink or go back to our roots. Also, we had a long time ago in USA, we have the settlement movement. So we were sitting in the communities. We were working with the communities as we were living with them. So I think there's a lot to be gained to live in the communities. And that is two things. First, it's to recognize neurodivergent social workers, we have to have them. And they are, of course, already here, but sometimes they don't come out because they feel it's too hard to be out as a neurodivergent social workers. But that is one thing, that we, within the kind of profession of social workers, we have to work with neurodiversity. So we kind of support each other to communicate and develop our ways of working to become more including on neurodivergent social workers. But then also to how to bridge, and I think that has been done in the queer communities, as we kind of been working that for a long time with this kind of combination of being community workers and individual. Also, like in RSL, Stockholm, Swedish Gay Lesbian Rights Organization, there have been both a kind of social workers working with people having difficulties in their lives, curatorer who's working age prevention or coming out discussions and so on. But they have been also working with the community as a really both and situation. So I'm not sure if that's a response, but it's kind of, we have to have both.
But do you think it's different working with this in school compared to child welfare services or in hospital or in prisons, for example? You have this theme is interesting in many places where you have social workers. Of course, school is one thing, but then you have all the other settings or the institutions that social worker work in. And do you have any reflections upon how to work with this in the different settings?
For me, it's very much about you have the community learnings or the knowledges which then can be used in an individual setting. So for instance, if I work in the school or in the prisons or whatever, and I have the community knowledge with me, it will support my communication and it will support my treatment. So even if I don't work perhaps in groups, that might be good too, but kind of, and I really think it's important sometimes to put people together in groups and have kind of, for instance, girl groups and have them support each other, peer support, so on. That is one thing. But then also to learn from the community, and that my kind of interventions and treatments are kind of based in the foundations of the community, because there are a lot of knowledge out there, but we don't listen. We kind of, oh no, it's not important because they just are. So I think that's really the knowledge gap here, is to kind of be together and work together. And then we can do individual, we need to do individual interventions sometimes, but we can do it with a kind of knowledge-based of community work.
Community-based.
Yeah.
And also, but you need some, you can use, for example, you have a base of knowledge that you can use everywhere.
Yeah.
And in this knowledge base is also knowledge about being a human being as everybody else.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, that's important.
Yeah.
So that I think aligns very good with social work practice.
Yeah, I
and
think it's like
ideology.
basic. If you work with different kinds of minorities,
Yes.
that's the thing.
So, but I think we can. I think this is really interesting because it's. I think many social workers, if we hold on a bit to practice, I think many social workers find it a bit difficult to work socially with things because much is based on diagnosis, individualistic way of thinking or reductionist way of thinking about the problem. It's your problem, it's not the society's problem or the group problem. So do you think that it needs a lot of work to go beyond the understanding of neurodivergency, understood as atypical, only seen as a diagnosis, for example?
We'll see if I can answer that too. So the thing is that, again, I think we have to think about this as a common social worker problem. And we have a lot of experience, again, back to the settlement movement. We know minorities. And not think about this as a very special kind of problem. Because now I think it's been hijacked by the psychiatry or the medical sciences to be a special problem. But it's just a social problem. It's just a minority who has really, really difficulties in the society. So I think we can be we know this. We have been doing it for the whole discipline's lives. We just think this is a new phenomenon, which we don't know. It's the same kind of minority problem, which we have to support people to be able to live their lives. So.
Yeah, I very much agree. But I think I will take this question now, which I thought about. Because this brings us up over to how to work with this in the academic community. As I said, I think it's really your perspectives, your work, and with your colleagues as well is really, really needed, and it's really interesting because then we can start to debate, we can start to discuss the different perspectives, the critical perspective, but also other perspectives. And I think for example, disability, then I see it from my point of view, from the disability studies. But disability is often associated with health or medicine. And it is not necessarily a central part in social work curriculum. It is there, but it's not a central part. It's not the big problem that are to be solved. How do you perceive that the academic social work accommodates the knowledge about neuroaffirmative social work?
I start to get tired also, so maybe I'm a bit now on my end. But
your experience, for example, when you work in this at your own university, is it welcomed, or do you? How is it? Yeah, how is it? How do they meet you when it comes to these discussions? Getting it into the syllabus, making it a priority?
I think it's growing awareness, at least in the environments I've been encountering, that this is interesting and that the things we've been doing, it doesn't work. So it's like a sense of, okay, we understand that this is interesting and what we have been doing hasn't been working. But it's like also, oh, shall we jump over to that cliff? It's like big almost epistemic worry.
Yeah.
Shall I leave everything I know about this behind? Yes, you have to, sorry. And to be really, really open that you don't know anything. And I think it's important to have, coming from queer studies again, Jack Halberstam is talking about unknowing. And in order to know, we have to unknow what we already thought we were knowing. But again, we can go to other places in social work. We can unknow what we think we know about autism and ADHD, but we can also take the things we already know about working with minorities. And I think that is the same when I can encounter this in academia. I can always say that, but we already do this. We already know this, but not in this context. We just have to take the tools from those toolboxes and reuse it here. And then I think it's becoming easier also for social workers and social work research. We do know how to work with communities as also in community-based research. We have those tools. So I just think we have to again, think we know this. We don't have to listen to the psychiatrists all the time. We don't have to think they know it best.
Yes. And it fits well into the discussion of minority
Yeah.
and the lectures that we give to students about minority perspective, for example. And it is at our department, it is getting better because we are including different articles or different studies in not specifically, for example, about disability, but it can also be about understanding majority perspectives. And I also think that, as you say yourself, because your critical perspective is that you are looking into not just one strand of the critical, but you see, for example, you draw from the feminist study, you draw from queer studies, CRIP study, you draw from different perspectives, and thereby you can learn. So that's really interesting.
So I think, at least for me, it's sometimes I meet students who really, oh, we have to understand DSM-5. And then it's like, I have to understand DSM-5. Yes, but no, you can look at this anti-stigma work you're doing with minorities in that ethnic, also that is useful here as well. You don't have to have the kind of, like the law book or something.
No. Yeah. But it's, my experience is that when you teach about, for example, disability, it's always, it takes quite a long time to get out of the
DSM-5,
or the body, thinking just about the body or the function. It's difficult to see the person as a social person.
Yeah, and also individual in that sense. I meet up with a person who may communicate different to me, but my professionalism is not just communicating with one kind of people. I have to learn to communicate with different kinds of people. That's part of my professionals. This is just another way of learning to communicate with another person.
Yeah.
So.
Because I saw on one of your slides that you talk about collaboration as well, the importance of collaboration. And that's that's what we, both in rehabilitation studies and also in social work studies, collaboration is very central. So yes, you could have had a lecture about the last slide as well, because that's really how to work with it and in a way, not in a specific way, but just to. I think that what I like with your work is that, yes, you write about something specific, but it's very similar to much of other work, studies that you can read about, which actually just confirms that continue good and holistic work and good collaboration. I think, let me see. Yes, one thing which I think is interesting is that social workers, when I talk to social workers or have interviewed social workers, they tell that they experience professionals or services disclaiming responsibility when it comes to, for example, disability and also neurodivergency. In the child welfare services, it can be said, that's not our responsibility. That is the habilitation services or the psychiatric outpatient services responsibility. And that's also about the support. Do you recognize this?
As I think the problem is that we do have neurodivergent people all around in social work. We have them in child welfare care, in the family situations, in the addictions, in the prisons. It's everywhere. So it's not like the disability category here. But I'm meeting up a person, a mother who has problem with her children or a burned out. And she might be also neurodivergent. And then I meet a person who has addiction, and that person may also have neurodivergence. I said that's all over the place. And that is also part of the problem, that we really want to put them into that kind of disability category when it's all over the place. Yeah. So I don't have any kind of advice. It's just to acknowledge that they are not just in one place. So we can't just say this is about habilitation of psychiatry because I happen to be working with them as addicts or whatever.
Yeah.
And that is our work.
Yeah, and that's really good, and I think that's what we need.
Yeah.
It is. Yes, I think that was the questions that I have. Maybe we can. Maybe there are some questions. Other who have some questions?
Thank you very much.
comments, reflections?
I will, but I'm kind of enthusiastic too. So it's very exciting, but if I start to get slow, it's like, yeah.